Hi guys, the title of the title you see on the screen today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and we'll get started.
This story begins in a city where many of its inhabitants have gathered to watch a girl being burned. And all these people were incredibly happy that such a tragedy would happen to this very girl. They called her names and said that this is how it should be done. People considered her act an abomination because they did not understand how such a person as her could be considered the king of their country. Everyone shouted that she was a traitor and must die. Therefore, soon the firewood that lay under her feet was set on fire, and people immediately rejoiced, because the fire began to develop more and more and already moved to the girl's body. But at that moment, suddenly a small stone flew at her head, which hit her so hard that she even got scared. The girl immediately decided to check what it was, but when she looked to the side, she saw that it was the children who had gathered in the square who were throwing stones at her. The fire was already spreading throughout her body, and she felt incredible pain. The girl tried to defend herself by saying that it wasn't her at all, and that they shouldn't burn her, but it was all useless. The fire had already engulfed her face, her whole body, and she was starting to die. After some time, the girl opened her eyes and realized that it was just a dream. She was lying on a luxurious bed and was shaking with fear, repeating all the time that she did not do it. But then, suddenly, hearing some screams, a fair-haired man came into her room. He addressed her, calling the girl the mistress, and asked if she had had a nightmare again. Not waiting for an answer from her, he came closer to her, and removing the blanket, asked if everything was okay with her. The girl was still shaking. Then he looked her straight in the eyes, and holding out his hand to check if she was alive at all, asked what was going on. The girl, when she heard this, had already responded. She turned away from him and, sighing heavily, asked what chores she would have to do with him that day. The man immediately explained that she had another appointment for that day with the elders, who had long been expecting an audience with her. The girl started to get out of bed, and the man asked if she needed help getting dressed. She didn't answer, and the man just took her coat and started to help her put it on her shoulders. His boss was silent the whole time, but the moment he wanted to fix her hair so that it wouldn't get caught in the jacket, the girl felt very strange. She felt his hand on her neck, immediately turned around and hit him very hard in the face. The guy was surprised when he felt this blow. He immediately looked at her and asked if something had happened, since he was just helping her get dressed. The girl, looking down on him, said that she was the boss, and he was just a servant, so she could hit him if she wanted. And then she asked if he had any other objections. The man at that moment got down on one knee and said that this was not at all the case, and he did not dare to object. Hearing this, the girl was pleased. She immediately turned around and began to quickly walk out of the room. But this guy had a rather strange reaction to the blow. As soon as she was far enough away that she could no longer see him, he touched his cheek and began to smile, as if he liked the pain. He was happy as long as the girl was happy, and even if he had to endure blows for this, he was ready to do it. Meanwhile, the lady had already come to that very audience with the elders. There were many people sitting at a round table, and they were discussing the news. One of the elders addressed everyone and said that this time, the Lord was 9 out of 10 confident of winning the election to choose a new king. The other guy agreed with him and said that whether it was strength or reputation, however, their Lord was much stronger than all the other lords, so they would definitely be able to win this election. The girl, meanwhile, sat and listened to them silently. But as soon as the conversation turned to these things, she said that if she was so strong, then why should Elder Rasu rely on others? As soon as everyone heard this, they immediately looked at the dark-haired boy named Raz and wondered if he dared to betray their lord in such a way. Raz, when he heard these accusations against him, immediately turned to the girl and asked what if she really knew everything, because now that territory was surrounded by his people, so he did not see any problem in this. But the guy didn't have time to utter another word, because the doors opened and someone's severed head fell with a crash onto their negotiating table. All the elders were immediately very surprised. They looked back to see who had brought this head, and then they saw a guy standing with a weapon at the entrance. He asked everyone for forgiveness and said that his knights had apparently just up and left. Of course, as soon as Raz saw the head of his knight, who was in that territory before, he immediately got angry and, looking at this guy, asked how this could even happen. When he was told the whole situation, he was very surprised and did not understand how he could have allowed this to happen. Why did he not fight the knights? He was the king of the wolves, who so strangely always won in such fights, even if he was alone. When the boy realized his mistake, he immediately knelt down in front of Alan, who was sitting and examining the tip of her sharp knife. The man said in a trembling voice that he understood perfectly well that he had made a mistake, and added that seeing how many years this had been happening to him was no longer bearable for him to endure. But at that moment the girl threw the sword to him and, smiling, said that he should do it himself. Even though it was completely absurd, the boy still took the sword and pointed it at his throat. He immediately wondered if she really had used the illusionary eye technique, and that was why the sword was directed even against his will. The elder simply begged her not to do it. But the girl at that moment, with the help of her beautiful turquoise eyes, could control this sword and kill this man with just one blink. That's exactly what she did. She sent that sword into his throat with just her mind. There was a huge scream that filled the entire room, and then he died. Of course, everyone kept silent so that this wouldn't happen to them. Then the girl spoke up and said that they should look at this situation with a clear mind. Alan addressed everyone, but at the same time looked at this corpse, saying that these were the consequences of the fact that he took and betrayed her. Everyone immediately began to shout in unison that she was a great girl, and also said that they all loved Lord Alan to death. But at that very moment, her assistant, who was standing next to the girl, noticed that she was trembling all over, despite the fact that she was trying to remain calm and balanced. He was very surprised that she was actually shaking all over, but he assumed that it was most likely because she had been using her abilities, and therefore her powers had faded a little. Some time passed from that moment, and finally the meeting ended. As soon as the girl left the hall, the people who were standing there immediately began to bow and greet her. When one of the elders bowed, he turned to another and said that he wondered what benefits Song had promised Raz for daring to betray Lord Alan. His friend replied that it was indeed strange, since Lord Alan's illusory eye technique was the strongest in the illusory snake clan. And with Vorek, who was a killer like a god and was always by her side, no one would have a chance to survive. When the man and his mistress came out into the street, he bowed and handed her the knife, telling her to take it. Alan immediately took it and was about to mount the horse when he suddenly put his hand on her waist and told her to be careful on the ride. Of course, as soon as the girl felt his hand on her waist, she was very surprised. Her cheeks turned red, but at the same time this embarrassment turned into anger. She looked at the guy with disgust, then swung a special horsewhip at him, telling him not to be so impudent. The girl hadn't hit him yet, but she continued to hold the whip up and asked who had allowed him to help her rise like that, holding onto her waist. The man was very surprised. He touched the place where she had swung the whip at him and asked how in that case he could help her get up in another way, because he had never seen such cases where it could be done without holding on to the waist. Alan was silent for a while, then lowered her head and told him to come closer to her, but he did it on all fours. The man was very surprised at first, but he had to obey her order. So, standing on his hands and resting his knees on the ground, he offered his back next to the horse for the girl. Alan was immediately pleased. She stepped on his back with both feet and easily climbed onto the horse. And just as she was about to leave, she said that from now on he should help her mount the horse in exactly this way, and asked if he understood it. The man didn't answer. He just shook his head and continued to stand like that on all fours until the girl finally left. The elders, who had come out into the street by that time, were very surprised. One of the men asked how the Lord could laugh and humiliate Vorek in front of everyone. His friend at this point responded that it was indeed very strange, and also said that he wondered if the guy would one day be able to not stand all this and rebel against such terrible behavior towards himself. As soon as the girl left, the elders noticed that he still hadn't even moved, so they assumed that he was most likely badly injured and couldn't even stand up due to the pain. In fact, this was not the case at all. The man was on all fours and smiling at what had happened, and also whispered that everything would be done as the master had ordered. Meanwhile, Alan had already arrived at her residence and, having gone upstairs, was about to enter the room. At the entrance, she was met by guards, and as soon as she saw them, she said that they should guard well and not allow anyone to enter inside. The men immediately bowed and said that they understood everything and that they would carry out this order. When Alan entered her room, she closed the door and, leaning against it, sighed heavily. The girl began to tremble again. She touched her head, which hurt a lot, and realized that this was happening to her again. In fact, what happened to her was all the consequences of overusing the eye technique with which she killed a man. Alan felt incredibly weak and could barely get to bed. She felt her heart hurt so much and she couldn't do anything about it. Then the girl still couldn't stand on her feet. She couldn't even climb onto the bed, but only sat on the floor next to him and breathed heavily. By that time, her assistant had already approached the room and, turning to the guards, told them to get out of his way. One immediately said that the girl ordered not to let anyone in, so they should follow her order. Vork, when he heard this, immediately looked at him with an icy gaze, and the guard, frightened of course, let him inside. As soon as the guy opened the door, he immediately saw that the lady was sitting on the floor near the bed and breathing heavily. He quickly approached her, asking what was going on. The man quickly tried to lift her up by touching her shoulders and asked if her pain had returned again. And Alan, as soon as she felt his touch on her body, immediately began to shout at him, asking who even allowed him to come to her. Work completely ignored her words. He took out some kind of flask and said that he found a special medicine for her headache, and also asked if she would like to try it. The girl had no choice. She really felt incredible pain all over her body. So she still agreed and tried this strange medicine. After a while, sweat started to drip down her face and she felt a little better. So she asked him where he got this strange medicine from. Her assistant immediately replied that he couldn't believe that she actually asked about it only after she had taken the medicine, and with a smile on his face, he asked if that meant she trusted him that much. Of course, Alan was very angry when she heard this. However, at that moment she wanted to do something to him, but she felt rather sleepy. Her eyes closed and her whole body weakened, and then she finally fell asleep. The man sitting next to her picked up her head and said that she was too tired and needed to get a good night's sleep. Some time had passed since then. The girl's assistant laid her down on the bed. She felt incredibly sleepy, even though she managed to wake up sometimes. Work, meanwhile, began to stretch her shirt and, moving closer, told her to have a good sleep. He was also glad that finally his mistress did not resist him. He ran his fingers over her body and then moved closer and closer, whispering in her ear that she smelled very good. After that, he bit her neck with his teeth so that a small stream of blood flowed down her body. Immediately after this, Alan woke up. She touched her neck but felt nothing there. For a while, the girl tried to understand what was happening, but then she realized that there was no one in the room. So she assumed that it was just one of her nightmares. Some time passed. The girl changed her clothes and already left her room. There, the guard approached her. He was about to explain, but she turned to him first and asked when Work had left last night. The man felt very guilty. He looked away and said that Work left immediately after bringing the medicine to the girl. Then she asked where he was at that moment. The man explained that Work had taken a vacation that day and had probably gone to church to see the Holy Child again. When Alan heard this, she was very surprised. She recalled moments from a recent conversation when she was on the street and asked why he was still standing next to her, since he had taken a vacation for that day. The man, looking straight at Alan, said that he liked being next to his mistress most of all, so he decided not to go anywhere. And now that the girl remembered all this, she was a little surprised to learn that he had left after all. But she assumed that he had decided to rest that day, so she didn't dwell on it too much. She returned to her room. The knights followed her in, and Alan asked them to prepare the carriage as she wanted to go away and take a walk. The man immediately asked her if she was going to go to church, but the girl replied that this was not the case at all. She wanted to go to Moody Prison. After some time, she reached that place. Alan was standing in front of the grate where two men were sitting, holding hands, despite the fact that they were separated by concrete pipes. For a while, the guys didn't notice her, but soon, seeing her, one of them turned to her and said that now was the decisive time of the elections, so she shouldn't come to this place at all, because otherwise it could undermine her reputation. But the girl replied that it was all good, because after everything that had happened, they were still once her subordinates, so she felt that she should be there at least sometimes. Her eyes suddenly filled with sadness, and she immediately apologized for not being able to protect him. and also asked if he had any special last wishes. She could take care of their families and give them everything they needed. The guy sat back down and said that she didn't really need to care about them because his family was the one who betrayed them. As soon as Alan heard this, she was genuinely surprised, because she did not know this detail and could not even imagine that the family went against their son. She stayed there for a while longer, talking with her old subordinates, and then headed back. The coachman, passing by the town, turned to her and said that there was a church on the way and they would pass by. He asked if she would like to stop there. Alan immediately said no. After that, she looked out the window and saw her assistant talking to some young girl. As soon as she saw them together, she was surprised. Of course, she couldn't bear the thought that he could smile so happily with someone else. Alan, angry, asked the driver to stop the carriage immediately. He did so immediately, and they stopped not far from the man. Work, meanwhile, was talking to this woman. He said that the medicine he gave to the Holy Child really helped. His mistress slept very well, and the headache immediately went away. The girl smiled and said that she was very glad to hear this and was also glad to help Mrs. Allen. But at that moment, Work suddenly heard the very familiar voice of his mistress. She came up to them and asked what they were talking about so happily. Work immediately turned his head to see who it was, and as soon as he saw his mistress, he was a little surprised, but at the same time very happy. Alan, meanwhile, ignored the girl standing next to her and immediately approached her assistant, saying that she had just happened to be passing by, and also adding that if he wanted to go back together already, he'd better hurry because the carriage was already standing nearby. The man, of course, was very happy when he was offered this, and running after her, he asked with a smile on his face whether she had really come specifically to take him with her. Alan, of course, said that it wasn't like that at all. Meanwhile, the girl standing behind her laughed nervously and realized that she had been ignored again, and it was downright heartbreaking. Meanwhile, Work sat opposite his mistress in the cart and was silent for some time before the girl addressed him herself. Alan asked how often he came to see the Holy Child. The man said with a smile on his face that this happens quite often. He noticed that the lady had recently had headaches, so he came to ask the Holy Child for medicine that helps her. As soon as she heard this, she was a little surprised, but after that, sighing heavily, she thought that he had come just for the medicine, and this was a little pleasant. Work, meanwhile, continued to smile and asked how she felt after taking this medicine last night, and also whether she had slept well after all. He even put his hand on her knee. The girl did not immediately pay attention to this, as she remembered that terrible dream she had had the night before, and because of this, she even blushed. The girl held back her emotions and immediately said that everything was fine, she slept well. But the man noticed how her voice and face changed, so he immediately smiled, pleased with this result. After this, Work moved closer to her, and laying his head on her knee, said that in that case she should not forget to take the medicine tonight, because it helps her. Of course, Alan was very upset when he did this, so she kicked him in the chest and told him to move away from her. And when Work found himself on the ground, she wondered if he could really trust this Holy Child who was giving him these medicines. The guy immediately started smiling and said that of course, because he had an aura that was very similar to Alan's, and he felt that they could trust him. That's why he decided to take medicine from this Holy Child. The girl looked at him suspiciously and wondered if he was really going to trust this man just because he had a similar aura. She thought it was really strange. The girl also asked who he would be faithful to, her or her aura. At that moment, Work touched her leg and, kissing her boot, said that, of course, his loyalty would belong only to her. He kissed her boot again and said that he would always be faithful to her, no matter what happened. When the girl saw that he was kissing her feet, she did not object and said that it was better for her, so she simply turned away from him and sat silently. Several hours had passed since then. The sun had already begun to set outside, and they had just returned to the estate. Alan walked ahead, and when she saw the maid, she immediately turned to her and asked her to prepare some hot water, as she wanted to take a bath after a long drive. As soon as Work heard about this, he immediately smiled and asked if she wanted him to help her with the bathroom. The girl, hearing this, was a little surprised. After looking at him, she turned away and said that she did not need it at all, and asked him to stay with the guards outside. Of course, the guy was very upset when he heard this, but he said that he would do as she ordered. After some time, the bath was ready, and Alan went there. The girl sat in the hot water and kept thinking about what was wrong with her. She even put a wet towel on her eyes so that they could rest a little. The girl still couldn't understand why she had the dream she had the night before, which also involved her assistant. She didn't understand why she could even think about such a thing. Alan also didn't understand what was going on at all, and most importantly, why it irritated her so much when she saw her assistant smiling at someone else. She immediately clutched the towel in her hands and thought that this was one of those inappropriate thoughts that she shouldn't have at all. When the girl got very angry, she hit the water with her hand and thought that there would be royal elections very soon, and if at that moment she was labeled a heretic, it would be very bad. At that moment, the doors suddenly opened, and the robe that the girl had thrown in that direction suddenly began to slide out the door. In fact, it was Work who took her robe and began to sniff it. He really liked the aroma. As soon as he sniffed it, he immediately smiled, thought about his mistress, and was very glad that he could smell her like this, even through things. But at that moment, he suddenly saw the door open. As soon as Work turned his head to the side, he saw his mistress standing above him. Looking more closely at her face, he immediately realized that things were bad for him. Meanwhile, Alan, who was angry, swung her foot at him. The girl changed her mind quite quickly. She immediately remembered that he had the same habit when he was still very little. He always sniffed her things, and she never scolded him for it. Of course, when the boy was still very little, she thought all this was very cute. But now she assumed that most likely her thoughts were definitely unstable, so she would have to do something about it. Work, meanwhile, sat very pleased, because due to the fact that the girl raised her leg, he had a rather interesting view before his eyes. As soon as Alan realized this, she immediately could not resist and hit him straight in the face, so that he moved away even several meters. Then the girl realized that he definitely deserved such a punishment. When evening came, the girl returned to her room. There was already a jar of medicine on the dressing table. In fact, after she took this medicine last night, her headache actually almost went away. At least, it didn't hurt so much that the girl almost lost consciousness. So without thinking twice, Alan opened the bottle and began to drink all the medicine in quick sips. And as soon as this substance spread throughout her body, she immediately fell asleep. And the girl again began to have a rather strange dream about how Work came to her and began to satisfy her. He seduced her with his kisses in rather interesting places. She also dreamed that the guy asked her if he could make love to her for real, and not everything that had happened before. As soon as the guy started getting closer to her, she finally stopped him and told him to stop. Because Work kept getting closer, she even scratched his chest with her nails because she was trying to stop all this. But immediately after this, Alan woke up. She was breathing heavily. There were tears in her eyes. The girl did not understand why she was dreaming all this immediately after such a medicine. Her assistant, who was nearby at that moment, immediately ran up to the girl and asked what had happened. He moved closer to her face and said that she was sweating so much and asked if she had had some kind of terrible nightmare. At that moment, the girl suddenly noticed his unbuttoned shirt and noticed scratch marks there. Alan immediately turned to him and asked why he suddenly had some wounds on his chest. She had to make sure of what she thought. The man immediately looked at his wounds and said that he most likely received them while sparring with other soldiers during a routine training session. Of course, the girl didn't believe it. She looked at him with a stern gaze, and Work, meanwhile, tried to withstand her pressure and not admit the truth. Meanwhile, the guy was standing on one knee, bowing his head to her, and the girl asked him to be more careful next time. The man immediately smiled. He was glad that she had not guessed the truth after all, and said that, of course, he would be very careful in the future. Meanwhile, Alan was about to get up, but for some reason her legs were very weak, and she couldn't hold on and began to fall. However, Work, who was nearby, was able to catch her. He told her to be careful, but the girl at that moment was very surprised and did not think at all about the fact that she was very close to him. She could not understand why her leg was so weak. Her assistant immediately asked her with great concern if she was really okay. The girl looked at him in surprise, not knowing what to answer. She even blushed because she couldn't get that terrible dream out of her head. When Work ran his finger along her cheek, he asked if she had a fever, and also why her face was so hot. The girl, of course, got angry. At that point, she slapped him in the face, telling him not to come so close to her again and to give her her own space. Of course, Work was upset, because he had disappointed his mistress again with such behavior, but he was still glad to spend at least some time with her. After some time, Alan had already changed her clothes. As soon as she left the room, she turned to the man who was standing near the door and told him to follow her. The guy was a little surprised, but she glanced at him and said that she would take him with her somewhere. In fact, she took him to a very happy event. In the main square, two guys she'd recently met in prison were being punished. They were tied to a post with chains. A great many people gathered to see them punished, and the punishment was severe. They were to be burned alive. The people were shouting, rejoicing that they were going to die. When Work heard all these shouts, he immediately turned to the hostess and asked where they had come to. Alan, looking straight at her old workers, said that their love was transferred to the church, and as a result, they were immediately declared heretics, sentenced to immediate death without the possibility of examination. The guy, hearing this, was indignant and asked, was it really all they did, that they loved each other? And he did not understand why in that case they were being punished for it. For him, such a situation was truly complete absurdity. The girl, then continuing to look ahead, wondered, is it really nothing? However, if you look at all those people and the hatred with which they rejoice at the death of two unfortunates, then you get a different impression of humanity. The men were incredibly angry. They were throwing pretty big rocks at these guys and saying that these heretics should be burned. They really didn't accept same-sex love and thought it was something wrong. People continued to throw stones at them, saying that they should die and no longer desecrate their world and church. Work was astonished by this event. He immediately turned to his mistress and asked why all these people wanted them dead. Alan at that moment pointed an arrow in their direction and said that this is the consequence of when people cross the line. Before Volk could even come to his senses, the girl released an arrow and pierced two guys so that they would suffer less while burning in the fire. The boys immediately screamed. They lost consciousness, and when the fire finally caught fire, they no longer felt the pain that should have engulfed their bodies. All the people around were happy and clapping their hands when they saw these people being burned, and Alan was very sad at that moment. She was incredibly sorry that she could not save them both. But in reality, she was trying to make their deaths as painless as possible. That's why she launched that arrow, so that they wouldn't feel what they could. As the fire engulfed their bodies, Work turned to the girl and asked why she had decided to bring him on that day and witness this inhuman execution. Alan, without even turning to the man, said that, of course, it was to remind him what he should not do. The man was a little surprised when he heard this, but he said that in order to increase his reputation among the people, in order to gain more support in the royal elections, the girl was ready to personally execute loyal subordinates who had served her for years. And this, of course, surprised him. He could not understand how this was even possible. Of course, Alan herself was very hurt to do this. Therefore, as soon as she heard these words, she got angry at the man, and raising her hand to hit him, said that he was behaving too impudently. However, the girl did not have time to hit him because Work grabbed her hand. As soon as she saw this, she was immediately surprised and asked what he was even allowing himself to do. The man, moving closer to his mistress, asked if his assumption was correct that she was the person who'd complained about them. The man insisted and asked if she really did it, because he was absolutely sure that it was she who told everyone about their love. For a while, the girl looked at him with a kind of frightened look. But then she began to get angry, and pulling her hand away from him, she again called him impudent and told him to immediately kneel down. Vork, of course, had to obey and carry out her order, but he looked at her with great hatred and asked, was she really using illusion magic on him again? This was precisely so, because the man would not have gone down on his knees of his own free will. He would have wanted to continue to defend his point of view. But the girl, glancing at him briefly, said that she thought his mind was not very clear at the moment. So she said she wanted him to get on his knees and think about his behavior and what and who he allows to say. Vork was so angry and wanted to somehow take revenge on his mistress for such humiliation. However, he could not move, and the girl in the meantime began to simply silently leave. Some people who were standing around immediately started whispering when they saw this situation. One of these men said that God had decided to insult Sir Work again. The other, agreeing with him, smiled and said that he felt it was not worth it for a man, but Work certainly could not give orders as firmly as their mistress. The first man, thinking over his words, said that he meant that rather than be so insulted, it would be better to rebel and become a lord himself, since in that case it would be much more profitable for him. At that very moment the man was freed from this spell, so he could already move. So Work came closer to the guy and grabbing him by the throat asked, "Does this really mean that the man wanted to see him as a rebel?" Of course, the boy immediately became frightened. He began to choke with fear and asked the master to spare him. But Work, meanwhile, continued to squeeze his throat even more. He moved closer to the man and asked why he did not tell him who his master was, and then Work would go there to raise a riot. The man did not answer. He only gasped and asked Mr. Work to spare him and not kill him. He had a lot of tears running down his eyes because he was so scared for his life. But at that moment, another guy came up to him and told Work to stop, because he would soon die. The man looked at Work with a pitiful look and explained that there were too many people in that place, and killing in front of everyone would certainly affect Alan's honor. Therefore, he needed to think about all this and stop. The guy squeezed his throat for a while but soon let go, and the man who dared to discuss his life immediately took a breath. After that, Work turned around and started to leave, saying that the dancing clown was exactly this guy, and he had no qualms about killing him. Meanwhile, the man lay on the floor, breathing in slow breaths. He had absolutely no idea that it would all turn out this way. When the guy who calmed down Work went after him and asked why he left as soon as he saw him, Assistant Alan, without even turning to him, said that their church could control the life and death of people at will, so he did not dare to look so high and associate with people like them. The guy, hearing this, was a little surprised. He, lowering his head down, immediately asked him for forgiveness and said that he also considered it unreasonable that same-sex love was considered nonsense and was punished even by death. Work had already slowed down, so his friend managed to catch up with the guy and ask, "Could the son of the Holy Church himself really say this?" The guy was, of course, very angry at these words, and he replied that he didn't just want to say this, he wanted to find a way to repeal this unfounded law and stop sacrificing people just because someone finds it unpleasant. As soon as Work heard this, he was very surprised. He stood still for a while and then looked at the guy in surprise and asked, "Is there really some way to cancel this terrible rule?" His friend replied in a very determined voice that he wished the man to ride with him in the same cart, and then they could discuss it at their leisure along the way. Meanwhile, Alan had already returned to her estate. She, due to the fact that she had really used her abilities, began to feel not very well. The maid who saw her condition immediately said that she looked very bad and asked if she needed to call a doctor. But the girl, waving her hand, immediately replied that there was absolutely no need to do this, and also asked, "Has Work really not returned yet?" The maid replied that he had not been there yet. As soon as Alan heard this, she immediately thought about it and realized that it was rather strange. And also, over all these years, she had learned one rule. It was very difficult to please him. At this point, the maid prepared tea for the mistress and told her to at least drink a little of it first, because perhaps then she would feel a little better. At that very time, Work was riding in a carriage with an acquaintance. The man asked whether it was true that in order for the king to repeal this terrible law, special approval from the church was needed. The man replied that this was indeed the case, and now Alan was the only one who had any hope of becoming the next king, and the man was to become the next leader of the church. So he believed that if they could come to an agreement, it could still be done. After some time of silence, he also said that if Alan did agree, it would be just wonderful, because for his part, he would do everything possible to ensure that this rule became effective. As soon as Work heard about this, he immediately made a very angry look and replied that he would do absolutely everything to make the girl agree, even if he had to put in a lot of effort to do so. Meanwhile, Alan fell asleep because of that terrible cup of tea. There was a special, very strong sleeping pill in it, after which the girl quickly passed out. She was sleeping, not feeling or hearing anything around her, so she didn't even suspect that the same maid who brought her this cup of tea had taken out her knife and was about to kill her. But at that very moment, the carriage had already pulled up to the Allen estate, and Work stepped out of it with slow steps. He was about to set off for the estate. But at that moment, a knight ran out to meet him, and seeing that the man had finally returned, he was very happy. He looked incredibly worried, and even frightened. As soon as Work saw his worried face, he immediately asked what had happened. And the knight, because he ran so fast, even managed to get out of breath. But after that, he explained that Lady Allen had been killed. As soon as the man heard this, he was so surprised and angry that he couldn't even utter a single word. He just stood there in a stupor. But, fortunately, Allen, due to the fact that she drank a small amount of sleeping pills in her tea, was still able to wake up in time and stopped the girl before she pierced her with a sword. The mistress looked at her maid and, smiling, asked her forgiveness. And she also said that, of course, she does not drink what is given to her, especially if it has not been checked. The maid immediately became very scared. She started shouting to the other people who were standing outside to start attacking, because Vork was gone, and this was their best chance to put their plan into action. But Allen meanwhile grabbed the girl's face with her hand, and pulling her towards herself said that, apparently, there were also accomplices in this matter. She also added that in this case, this interested her even more. Then the girl activated her magic ability, and looking at her, said that in that case, she wanted to see how they would all tear each other apart. Vork, of course, upon hearing that his mistress had died, immediately began running to her office. He immediately turned to the knights and said that if she had been attacked, then why had no one helped her in this? The knight who was trying to catch up with the man said that it was not that they did not want to. It was just that they could not even approach Lady Allen. At that very moment, Work ran into her office and saw the girl standing in a pool of blood. There were many corpses around her, and in particular, it was her maid who had started this whole horrible attempt at murder. Work, seeing the lady, immediately came closer to her and said that he had already returned, so she did not need to worry. The girl, breathing heavily, immediately looked at the guy and was about to say something to him. However, she had used too much of her magic power, so she had no more energy left. So Allen didn't even have time to finish her sentence before she fell right into the man's arms, unconscious. The man hugged her, immediately kissed her on the back of the head, and asked for forgiveness for having arrived too late to help her. A lot of time passed from that moment. Her assistant immediately transferred the girl to the bedroom and blindfolded her, and after several hours, she finally came to her senses. Work immediately forbade her to remove the bandage and said that the doctor examined her and said that she had exaggerated the technique of illusion magic, so now she needs to avoid using her eyes for a while. Of course, the girl was very surprised when she heard this, but she said nothing, and her assistant replied that it was all his fault. He should have been there and definitely protected his mistress, so he asked her to forgive him for it after all. Allen, meanwhile, told him to just forget about it, because it was also a good opportunity to lure out the hidden killers. So if you look at it from the other side, it all went very well. The man, meanwhile, leaned over her bed and, holding back his tears, said that now, when he thought about it, he still felt that horror from the mere thought that she might not exist. He was quite sentimental, and putting his arm around Allen's leg, said that until she got better, he wanted her to let him stay close and protect her. He wished the girl would let him be her eyes. Allen, meanwhile, was a little surprised. She knew perfectly well that she couldn't see anymore, so she would really have to rely entirely on this man. She thought that everything should go well, so she still allowed him to be near and help her. Allen put her hand on his head and said that she agreed to this. The next day, when she got up in the morning and breakfast time had passed, Allen, of course, could not do it on her own, so her faithful assistant decided to help her with this. He handed the girl a piece of dessert and asked the lady if she would like to try something sweet. The girl herself didn't know yet whether she wanted this, but Work insisted on his own and told her to open her mouth, and then he would put dessert in there for her. Despite the fact that the girl considered all this very humiliating, she still listened to him, because with her eyes closed, it would have been very difficult for her to do even such simple things. And as soon as the man saw how sweetly she did it, he immediately blushed. He thought that when Allen was so helpless, she looked even better than usual. He looked at her lips and thought only that they looked incredibly soft and pleasant. Of course, he would very much like to kiss them, but he could not allow himself to do so. When Alan sat like that for some time with her mouth open, and the food still did not come to her, she turned to the Vork and asked why he did not give her the sweetness he had told her about. The guy immediately became embarrassed and asked her to forgive him for this. He said that he was just thinking for a bit, and then he still handed her the cake. As soon as the girl bit it, it got her lips a little dirty. So the Vorka decided to wipe all the remaining crumbs from there and blushed even more, because it was incredibly pleasant for him to touch Alan's lips. The girl herself actually blushed. She turned away from him and said that she did not want to eat anymore, so she asked him to take her to the training. Of course, her assistant didn't like all this, because she ate practically nothing. He was about to tell her about it, but Alan insisted and said that too much time was spent on this food, and she didn't have enough time to just throw it away like that. The man finally listened to her. He bowed his head and said that he understood everything, so he would take her to the office so that she could study. Then Work came closer to her and already grabbed her by the legs, thereby holding her in his arms. Alan felt all this, immediately began to scream, asking what he was doing at all, because she said that he was helping her walk and not carrying her at all. But the guy smiled at that moment and said that it would be much faster this way, and also to touch her a little on the raw. He said that he just wanted to save her time, that's all. Alan was not in the best position to resist and argue, so she had to just accept the situation, and despite her beliefs, she had to be in the man's arms while he carried her to the office. Of course, she felt very awkward and unpleasant about all this, but she tried not to even show it on her face so that he would not misunderstand everything. But Work enjoyed being able to hold her and help with everything. It meant he spent a lot more time around her once she was swaddled. He even liked the fact that from that moment on, his body and mind were finally focused on his mistress. But then he suddenly thought that if she suddenly one day became blind forever, then he was ready to be there and help her in absolutely everything. At this point, Work began to worry a lot about the girl, and because of this, his hands tightened much more tightly around her waist. As soon as Alan felt all this, she felt unpleasant and even painful. She said that he was holding her too tightly, so she asked him to loosen his grip a little. As soon as the man heard this, he immediately felt uneasy. He asked her for forgiveness and finally loosened his grip so that she would feel comfortable. And after that, Work began to think that he absolutely should not keep such terrible thoughts in his head, because it would be a real tragedy if the girl really remained blind. Some time passed from that moment. They finally came to the office, and Alan, sitting at her desk, handed him some documents. Since her eyes were not working, she asked the man to read these letters to her. Work was a little surprised when he heard this and asked if he was really allowed to do this, since these letters could contain some confidential information. But the girl insisted on her own and said that since she could not trust him, then in this world there would not be a single person she could trust. Even though it sounded rather confusing, Work realized that it was a plus in his favor. So he was very pleased that the girl really trusted him, and he was glad. However, at that moment he felt a little sad, because he understood that Alan trusted him very much. However, he was still afraid of hurting her. The man also believed that he simply deserved to die for leaving her alone in a very difficult situation. A few hours later, already closer to the evening, it was time for the bath. Of course, Work had to help the mistress there too. He said that the water in the bath was ready, so leading her to the edge, he said that he would wait for her outside in that case. But at that moment, the girl suddenly grabbed his hand when he was about to leave and asked him to stay in this place with her, because she now could not see anything and was completely helpless. As soon as Work heard this, he was very surprised. He didn't know if he could really stay there with her, because in the past, when she took a shower, she always ordered him to leave. However, now the girl even began to insist that he stay. As soon as Alan began to undress, he realized that this was the first time he could see the mark on her back so closely. He was also very pleased with the thought that he could see her body when she was bathing. It all turned out to be even more amazing than he had imagined. The girl, meanwhile, had already climbed into the bathtub, and Work, coming up behind her, reached for her hair and thought that he didn't know how one could be such a beautiful, but at the same time very fragile work of art. He took some of her hair and running his finger through it, realized that it all felt very pleasant. He was also incredibly happy with the thought that the girl had completely entrusted her fate to him. He brought her hair to his nose and smelled that wonderful scent. He liked the fact that he now had more freedom. Of course, Alan immediately felt that he was touching her hair and asked why he was doing it. Then Work decided to make it even better for him. So he asked her if it was true that she was very uncomfortable taking a bath blindly. Therefore, he wanted to help her do it. As soon as the girl heard this, she immediately became embarrassed. She understood perfectly well that other nobles were also bathing, and the combination of her words did not speak of the fact that she could not see anything at all now. So, despite the fact that she was very embarrassed about this, she still agreed to this help. While Work began to wash his mistress's body, he also began to imagine various scenes, namely how he runs up to her and kisses her, because he sees that she is very pleased with his touch. But pretty quickly, his idea simply collapses, because Alan turns to him and asks if everything is okay with him, and also why he suddenly stopped. The man immediately became embarrassed, because it had all just seemed that way to him. He asked her for forgiveness, and said that he had only been distracted for a moment. Work thought that it was too dangerous. If he was going to do it right now, then of course the girl wouldn't let him get close again even in the near future. So he had to restrain his desires in order to be around her as much as possible. After Alan took a bath, she changed her clothes and went outside. There she was already accompanied by a guard, and she wondered where Work had gone. The guard replied that he had gone to church, but she could be sure that before he left, he had already chosen several reliable knights who would be responsible for her safety, and if anything went wrong, they would be responsible for it with their lives. Alan was a little surprised to hear this. She didn't think that going to that god at such a difficult time was the best decision, but in reality, it was no wonder that his head had been in the clouds all these days, so he probably wanted to unwind a little and clear his various thoughts. As soon as the man came to this church, the girl who was there immediately inquired what had happened, and because he lingered there, she also inquired whether he had come for more than just medicine. Work immediately explained that he would like to take the medicine for himself this time. The man, with his head down, said that he would like to inquire if there was any medicine that could help him control his sexual desire. The girl, hearing this, was a little surprised. However, turning to him, she said that this was the most powerful sedative. After taking it, he would lose consciousness for a while, but the effect would be very good. So she also asked him not to take this medicine too many times because the side effects could be too bad. Work immediately thanked her for this and took the medicine, and after that he began to leave so that no one would see him. When the man left, the girl smiled and thought that she would never give him something that would control his attraction. In fact, the girl gave him drugs that make him completely unconsciously give up his desire in a sexual way. And all this is done in order to take revenge on his girlfriend, also not knowing whether his mistress will be able to bear all this.